Hi everyone. There are two learning goals for this lecture. The first is to understand the guidelines for conducting ethical research, and the second is to understand the importance of debriefing in social science research. I'm going to start by defining the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, because this is a really important organization when we're thinking about evaluating research ethics and ensuring and safeguarding research ethics in human subjects research. The IRB is the oversight committee that conducts ethical review before research begins. At universities in particular, it's usually comprised of other academics from a variety of different departments across the university. And what will happen is that you, as a researcher who wants to conduct a study, you'll first write a proposal, an outline basically of what you're planning to do. You'll submit it to this organization called the IRB, and other academics are going to review it with both ethical and legal questions kind of in mind, basically evaluating and verifying that you can do what you want to do. And this process can take weeks and months, given how many people need to look at it. And then if there are revisions required and you kind of have to go back and forth, this can take quite a bit of time to actually get approval to do your study. And often it's going to require modifications before they say, okay, yes, you can do that study. They'll sometimes say, no, you can't do that study that way. That's unethical, that's illegal, whatever it might be. And you'll have to make some changes, some tweaks before they say, yes, you can do that. And then after you get approval, you need to actually adhere to what you said you were going to do when you're conducting that study. Essentially, you can get audited later where they'll check to see, did you actually do the study the way that you said you did? And you better have followed the procedures that you laid out in the application. Otherwise, you can get into some trouble. And so the idea of this IRB is that it's in place to ensure that the research we're doing is ethical and legal and not harming the human subjects that are participating or violating their rights in some way. And different IRBs are going to look different across different universities, and also some private organizations are going to have their own IRBs made up of usually academics, but professionals in those particular fields will often be assigned to those kinds of IRBs. So when IRBs review research for human subjects, they are only going to be responsible for studies that actually involve research activities and that actually involve human subjects. So I'm going to take a moment to break down what we mean by research and what we mean by human subjects, in part because I want to talk about what things do not count as research and what does not count as human subjects, and thus wouldn't be required to undergo IRB review. So when we say research, what we mean is a systematic investigation that contributes to generalizable knowledge. And this means knowledge that isn't just meant to apply to the particular study sample that you collected, but it's actually intended to represent some kind of larger group or larger population, or be applied and used in other contexts other than the one in which it was collected. So it's potentially easier to think about what this does not mean to understand what it does mean, because, I mean, you can imagine, okay, yeah, conducting surveys, doing experiments, these things fall under the purview of research. But this would not include students doing kind of small studies for a class assignment, kind of like what we're planning to do in our class here, because this isn't intended to represent generalizable knowledge. It's just meant to be a class exercise for you to learn the steps of conducting a study. So anything that we learn from that particular study, we're not going and planning to publish it in an academic journal or report it in any formal sense. It's really just for you to learn the steps of the research process and to turn in that work for a course assignment. That would not need to undergo IRB review because it's not intended to produce generalizable knowledge. It's just an exercise for your learning purposes. It would not include interviews for news stories. So, journalists don't have to get IRB review every time they're going out and interviewing sources for a story, because that is really just supposed to be reporting the facts of a new unfolding news story. It's not meant to be producing generalizable knowledge to, make predictions or hypotheses about how things would work in another setting. It's really just to understand, what's going on here for the purpose of letting other people know what is going on here. So journalists, although they're doing interviews often with many, many, many people over the course of doing a study or over the course of doing a story, they're not having to go and get IRB approval every time they're doing that. And then it also doesn't include just internal evaluations that are, you may be conducting a survey or like conducting a study in some sense, but it's not intended to be reported outside of the organization, thus isn't generalizable and kind of isn't publicized in that way. So internal evaluations, so for example, course evaluations that we would do in the context of this class, at the end of the semester, or like the midterm evaluation that you'll complete shortly, that is just for our internal purposes, understanding how the class is going, making modifications to the class. So I don't need to get IRB approval every time I want to, find out how things are going and do I want to do something about that. If I wanted to take that information and then go try and publish a research paper out of it in an academic journal, in that case, yes, I would need to get IRB approval to do that because I'm using it for more than just internal purposes. I'm now trying to take it and do something else with it. And so in that case, an IRB would want to ensure ethical approval before I do that kind of study. So it really depends here, both like, what are you doing? Like what kind of research activities are you engaged in, but what are you planning and intending to do with that information once you have it? Is it, just to report the facts? Is it just for your internal purposes? Is it just for an educational assignment? Or are you intending this data that you're collecting to reflect something else, that you actually want it to be generalizable knowledge that you want other people to have access to and understand and read about? And then when we talk about human subjects, this might seem kind of obvious. We mean these are living individuals for whom the investigator obtains data either through intervention or by interacting. And this doesn't need to mean face-to-face interaction. It can mean kind of online interaction where maybe I'm emailing you a survey and you're filling it out. Living individuals being a key thing. So when we start thinking about deceased individuals, there's kinds of different layers of questions that might be asked. We won't get into that. But the main thing I want to point out here is that a common method used in communication research are what we call a content analysis. And so in those cases, we might be analyzing, TV shows or commercials or newspaper clippings and so forth. And so those kinds of publicly mass-produced commercial content, if we want to analyze what's in that content and, make claims and make generalizations about what people are reading and watching and listening to, we generally don't have to get IRB approval to do that work because we're just engaging with content that has been produced for public consumption. We're not actually engaging with the people who made that content or talking to them. Where it gets a little more iffy is when we think about like social media posts where individuals have actually created that content and put it out in the world. Generally, we do not have to get IRB approval if we're just going to be accessing public social media things that have been put out into the world. If I want to start getting access to maybe more private information, like maybe personal messages that you've been sending to others on social media, like your dating profile that maybe you've posted and like those sorts of things that are less public and more specific to these particular situations or that are actually private information that you're exchanging within those applications. In those cases, yes, I'm probably going to have to get IRB approval. And in some cases, depending on the kind of information I want to pull from maybe your public posts, IRB maybe is going to be more or less interested based on how private or vulnerable maybe that information that I want to access is. But for the most part, if it's public, if it's posted for mass consumption, you're not going to have to get IRB approval because it's already out there in the world. And when we think about the kind of guiding principles that are that we're using to judge, is research that we're doing meeting ethical principles? There are three main guiding principles that we think of. We want to avoid harming people as much as possible. We want to make sure that we get informed consent, as informed as possible in order to carry out the study. So people know what they're agreeing to do in advance and they're not, being surprised by something that comes up over the course of a study. And that people are voluntarily engaging in those studies. They're not feeling coerced or pressured to do that study. It's actually their own free will. They know what they're being asked to do and they're volunteering to do it. To illustrate these principles, I think it's helpful to think through different study designs and the kinds of questions those study designs might raise. So let's think of kind of a classic historical example of something like trying to study smoking behavior. So you might have a prediction, and decades ago, many people had this prediction that smoking causes lung problems. You might hear that today and say, okay, yes, we know that pretty well now from all the research that we have done. But let's say we live in a world where we weren't certain of this yet. But we had a hypothesis, we had a prediction that I think smoking is causing people to have lung problems, trouble breathing, emphysema, asthma, potentially even lung cancer, and so forth. Let's imagine I then propose this study. I want to recruit 100 teenagers who don't smoke, and I'm going to ask 50 of those teenagers to smoke once a day for 3 months, and I'm going to ask 50 of those teenagers to continue to not smoke for 3 months. So an experimental kind of randomized control intervention that I might try to do here. I want 50 people to start smoking, 50 people to continue to avoid smoking. You might look at this now and say, wow, we can't do that. You'd be causing a bunch of harm. You'd be putting people into a situation that's increasing their risk potentially for lung problems. But even backtracking, before we had kind of high quality research to say that was the case, the ethical question that comes up is to say, you have this prediction that smoking is going to cause lung problems. We don't have great evidence of it yet, maybe. But is it ethical for you to do something that you think maybe is going to be harmful for these people? And so there are different questions that might arise. Like you might say, well, what if I tell them very clearly in advance, here are all the potential things that might happen to you as a consequence of participating in this study. We think that this behavior might be linked to these bad things. If they're giving informed consent, maybe it's okay for them to engage in that study. Despite the fact that there's going to be some amount of harm that might occur, maybe that's outweighed by the fact that there's informed consent and that we're going to learn something really valuable from that study. And you might say, well, okay, I'm going to make it really worth their while. I'm going to give them $1,000 for this 3-month study. They're going to participate, smoke 1 cigarette a day, and we're going to let them have it. So both of these potential modifications still raise ethical quandaries. Even if they're informed of the harms in advance, do we actually believe that they understand the potential consequences that might have to them? And given that this is a sample of teenagers rather than adults, we might say, well, maybe teenagers have less of a decision-making capacity than an adult would to be kind of volunteering to be in this study. And in fact, in the case of teenagers, we're going to have to get parental consent regardless. So there's going to be another layer of complexity in there to get them into a study like this. And when we start kind of thinking about really large sums of money, this can really start to interfere with the sense of, oh, people are volunteering. They're not being coerced or pressured into participating. So although we do generally want to offer some kind of incentive for people to be in research, we often want to limit kind of the size of that incentive because at some point it can become such a large sum of money that it's difficult to refuse. It's difficult to say no. Now, in the current state of things in the world, we're not often getting large sums, we're not offering huge, outrageous sums of money. But ethically, it can be concerning, and particularly when we think about private organizations, maybe not academics that are doing research that maybe have access to lots and lots of money to be offering, it starts to get a little iffy in some cases. So the idea here is that particularly when we're thinking about wanting to research something that might create harm, that in itself is a problem. But even if we're kind of giving people the information they need to understand that harm in advance, even if they are informed, are they kind of are they able to recognize the potential consequences in a way that they really understand what they're agreeing to do? And then am I kind of offering them an incentive that is appropriate for what I'm asking them to do without becoming so large that they really can't say no? And this becomes really important when we're thinking about more vulnerable populations, such as teenagers who maybe don't have a lot of money, such as maybe low-income adults who could really use, an extra $500, $1,000, and so forth. So when we're thinking about vulnerable populations, we need to be really aware of the kinds of incentives we might be offering. And so I pose all this to say, if you wanted to do this kind of study, here's the kinds of ethical questions that might be arising. And I pose that for the example of smoking because we can now look at that kind of study design and say, hey, we know enough about smoking to say, maybe that's not the study we're going to let you do. The IRB might look at that and say, hey, an experimental intervention like this is not okay. You can't run that kind of study. You're going to have to make some modifications before we would let you do it. And that would be completely understandable. But we can think about something where we have a more mixed evidence base and more uncertainty about what the implications are in the current research base. So something like researching social media use. So as we've been thinking about this semester, I might have this prediction that social media use causes attention problems. And that maybe has a lot of logic behind it, but we maybe don't have great studies to say, yes, there really is this causal relationship between these variables, and I feel pretty confident in that causal relationship. And so mirroring the study that I just proposed, I might recruit 100 teens who have never used TikTok before. I might ask 50 of them to scroll TikTok for 30 minutes every day for 3 weeks. And I might ask 50 of them to avoid using TikTok for 3 weeks. Even though the research maybe is mixed or uncertain about the impact of social media use on attention, I'm still making this prediction that it's going to cause maybe this negative outcome, this outcome that people would maybe like to avoid. And so similar kinds of ethical questions are arising. Is it ethical to ask teenagers or adults to do something that might cause harm in their life? If one of our ethical principles is to avoid harm as much as possible, should I really be asking people to do anything that could be causing some degree of harm? Is what we're going to learn from that study outweighing the kinds of harm that might be caused? And even if I were to tell them in advance, do they have the decision-making capability or, the frontal lobe development to really reckon with the consequences of the thing I'm asking them to do? And am I kind of offering an incentive that is appropriate for the task that I'm asking to do? What is the right amount of money that's appropriate remuneration for what they're being asked to do? That's not so much that they feel like they can't say no. They could still, reject that offer and feel like they haven't lost out on something in their own life. And similar to the smoking example, an IRB might look at this and say, hey, the kinds of harm that could happen from this study do not outweigh what you're going to learn, doesn't outweigh, even if you have informed consent, even if you're paying them an appropriate amount. Again, $1,000, in this case, probably too much money. We might want to offer something a little less, maybe in like $100 range, who knows, $50 range. It kind of depends on the context. But ethical questions that are arising, an IRB might say, heck no, you cannot run this study. So an IRB, I might then say, hey, I still want to run this study. I think this is important information that we need to learn. Could I modify the study in some way that would allow you to allow me, that would convince you to allow me to run the study? So the IRB might say, okay, well, how about you recruit 100 teens who are already using TikTok? You ask 50 of them to continue using TikTok as they usually have been for 3 weeks, and you ask 50 to avoid using TikTok for 3 weeks. This is just a slight change to the study design, but researching the same question, just kind of the inverse of the question. Now the focus of the study is on, can I actually reduce harm that's already happening out in the world by removing this thing that I think is harmful? So similar to smoking, I could potentially recruit people who are already smoking and try to get them to stop smoking for a few weeks, for a few months, whatever it might be. So in this case, the argument is, hey, there's already, I think I have a prediction that harm is occurring in the world. And I think by doing this, I can actually lessen that harm. And in that case, an IRB might be much more open to that kind of design because it's not you, the researcher, creating the harm. It's you, the researcher, going out in the world and trying to reduce that harm that's already happening. Now, other ethical questions then come into play. I just wanted to kind of give you that example, but just note that if it does turn out to be the case that like you find in your study, hey, this intervention that I'm doing is actually meaningfully reducing this harm that I was predicting, it then becomes ethically dubious to not spread that benefit to the other people in your study. So what'll sometimes happen is that at the end of that study, the other participants need to be informed, like, hey, here's what we learned from this study. We encourage you to do and adopt these same behaviors. Here are the potential benefits to you. Sometimes people will run these studies where you're in one condition for a little while, and then you flip to the other condition for a little while, so that the harm is kind of like or the benefits are evenly distributed across the conditions. But all this to say that when you want to run a study, even with kind of these more ethically dubious questions, the IRB is first going to ask themselves, what are these questions that we should be thinking about? And if they don't want to let you do that version of the study, they might work with you to try and figure out, what version of the study could we then do. All right, and then just an interesting kind of specific, unique aspect of social science research is that sometimes we cannot run our studies if people were fully informed of what they were about when they're signing up for it. And so in some cases, we do need to use deception in order to run our studies in a way that we're going to get meaningful results. And so deception means that we're obscuring or altering information that are presented to participants in order to hide the true purpose of the study. And the reason this is a problem is because it's directly challenging the notion of informed consent. I'm not going to tell people exactly what's going to happen in the study because I need to get meaningful data. But the thing they're consenting to is not actually necessarily the entirety of the thing that's actually going to happen. So the IRB is only going to let this happen when the topic can only be studied with the use of deception. And in cases where it's not going to cause severe emotional distress and it's not going to cause any physical pain. So we can't be talking about harm in this case that is really noteworthy. It has to be a situation where, they're not going to be harmed whatsoever, ideally, or any harm that might occur is going to be easily rectified at the end of the study. So let's look at an example of how this might. Before we look at an example, just note that if we use deception in a study, the IRB is going to require us to include a debriefing at the end of the study. And that's going to mean that we're going to reveal the true purpose of the study to participants at the end, allowing them to withdraw and attempting to minimize any harm or risk that might have emerged by essentially lying to them over the course of the study. There are several things that must happen. This must occur after the use of deception in any IRB approved and reviewed research study, ideally right away, as soon as possible at the end of the study. It has to explain the true intent of the study and must attempt to minimize harm, usually by offering professional resources like mental health counseling, depending on the context. And participants must be allowed to withdraw. Basically, at the end of the study, they should say, hey, we recognize that we lied to you about what the study would be about. Now that you've finished, here's what it's actually about. Would you still like your data to be included in the study? And you need the opportunity to say, hey, now that I actually know what you're doing here, I don't support it, I'm withdrawing, I'm kicking my data out of the study. And that would be a completely appropriate response in some cases to the fact that you've been lied to. So let's look at an example of what this could actually manifest in a real study. So this study is called Comfortably Numb, the Desensitizing Effects of Violent Media on Helping Others, conducted by a researcher who's here at the School of Communication, Brad Bushman. At the time, he was at the University of Michigan, but he is now currently in the School of Communication. And in this study, they had a prediction that playing violent video games might reduce real-world helping behavior. So a kind of riff on this more harsher hypothesis that you might have that playing violent video games might lead to aggressive or antisocial behaviors. So you can imagine maybe the IRB doesn't want to let you study that specifically because we don't want to create harm, but we could maybe study this alternative version where it might reduce the degree to which people are helping each other in the real world. So a kind of safer alternative to this hypothesis that we might have. But in this case, independent variable being playing violent video games, dependent variable being real-world helping behavior. This was an experimental design. They recruited undergraduates to play either a violent or a non-violent video game, and then they were putting them into this situation to see whether or not they helped a person who was seemingly in distress. And they essentially had to lie to people about what was happening in the study, and I'll show you why. It's a pretty complicated but very interesting design. All right, so here we see, I'm going to show you some excerpts of the method and just kind of use them to talk through what happened in the study. So participants here were told that the researchers were studying what types of people like various types of games. After giving consent, they were assigned to one of 4 violent games or one of 4 non-violent games. And they set a timer for 20 minutes, and then afterward they're going to fill out a questionnaire. So here you can see they're not being told the full extent of the study. They're just saying, hey, this is about what people like in various games. They're not being told that it's about the effect of violence on helping behavior. And you can imagine why. If you knew going in, hey, some of you are going to play violent games, some of you are going to play non-violent game, then we want to see how nice you are. You're then kind of sensitized to, okay, well, I want to make sure I'm not super mean, regardless of which game you're playing. So it might kind of mess with the effect of the experimental intervention that we think is unrealistic or unlike what would happen in reality. And they kind of amped up the deception quite a bit in this study. So here's what they did. It's quite interesting. Basically, after you finish playing the video game, while you're filling out this questionnaire, the researchers are then playing an audio recording of a pre-recorded fight between two people outside in the hallway. So you're led to believe that there's these two people out in the hallway, a male actor and a female actor, I think two male actors and two female actors, if I recall. And you hear them getting in this kind of tussle, this really loud verbal argument outside, where they devolve into a shouting match. I think about somebody stealing the other person's boyfriend or girlfriend. And, here's an excerpt from the script that they're using. The first person saying, "You stole her from me. I'm right. You know it. You loser." Second actor saying, "Loser. If I'm a loser, why am I dating your ex-girlfriend?" And it kind of keeps going. And the actor says, "Okay, that's it. I don't have to put up with this shit any longer." They then throw a chair onto the floor, making a loud crash, making it really sound like this fight is occurring outside in the hallway. And then there's this exchange where they're kind of acknowledging that they've hurt the other person, disregarding their pain, and then walking away, refusing to help the person. So the experimenter has essentially created this situation where you're sitting in the lab as the participant, led to believe there's this kind of loud and physically aggressive fight occurring in the hallway. And what the researcher is interested in is whether or not you actually go out into the hallway to help this person after the fight. And they went to a lot of extent to basically validate that this fight was believable and people actually were under the impression the fight was actually occurring. So they did a lot of pilot testing to ensure that's the case. But they want to see, basically, after you've heard this loud fight, do you go out in the hallway and help? And does that vary based on which kind of video game you played in the study? So again, the deception has occurred here that the participants were only told that researchers were interested in what types of games participants like. They were not told that this was about violence, and they were not told that they were going to be subjected to this potentially distressing kind of argument outside in the hallway. So they note in the study that they did have to engage in this debriefing afterward. They had to explain that the fight wasn't real. They had to explain why deception was needed. They had to assess whether the participants experienced harm. They had to offer counseling resources as a way to try to remedy harm. And they had to allow participants to withdraw their data. Because you can imagine, in this particular case, if you find out at the end of this study, like, hey, we were actually interested in whether or not you helped that person, and hey, you didn't go help that person, you might feel a little angry, frustrated, distressed yourself to realize, like, oh, when I'm put into this situation, I'm not somebody that goes and helps. And also, maybe just hearing the fight in itself was kind of distressing. So a lot of kind of ethical questions then arise based on this kind of design. And so an IRB would potentially agree to let you do this kind of study, to employ this kind of deception, if they're pretty certain that the harm that could arise is not that distressing, and that through debriefing, we can rectify and remedy and reduce any harm that might have occurred. And so in this case, they managed to get IRB approval with this proper debriefing in place. But you can see how these ethical questions kind of come up and bump up against each other as we're trying to argue, hey, the knowledge we're going to glean from this outweighs the sort of ethical questions that might arise, and we're going to try to reduce any ethical concerns through these kinds of research designs. And then just really quickly, another thing to note, privacy, which we'll talk more about in class, is another aspect to be thinking about when we think about research, is that this notion that the data provided by a participant is going to be used ethically, and we're not going to reveal their identity without their explicit consent. And this is especially important for studies where we may be looking at quite sensitive information, so information about your health, your finances, potentially criminal or illegal activity, and particularly important for vulnerable populations who maybe have limited or restrained decision-making capabilities, like minors, prisoners, abuse victims, so people who might be in situations where revealing that they participated in a study might put them into danger in some way. And so we think about privacy and we think about the data that we're collecting in these kinds of contexts. And I mean, we think about it in every context, but particularly these sensitive contexts, because violating privacy and maybe revealing that people participated in a study or revealing the kinds of answers they revealed in a study or that they communicated to us in a study could result in negative outcomes like ostracization, guilt, even physical harm, depending on the kinds of data we're collecting and who that information is maybe inadvertently revealed to. And so we want to try to safeguard privacy as much as possible, and we'll talk about 2 ways to do that. So when we think about safeguarding privacy, the first way is that we might just keep people completely anonymous when they're in our study. That basically the researcher does not collect any identifying information about their participants and cannot actually connect their responses to any particular individual in real life. So this applies to the actual way that the data is collected. So imagine you come into my lab and I say, "Hi, what's your name?" You say your name is Alex. Maybe it's me coming into the lab. But I don't ask you your last name. I don't record that information. I'm maybe only asking you very basic demographic information like your age, gender. Maybe I don't ask about your race. I don't ask about things like sexual orientation, other things that might be identifying factors. And so I'm going to collect very minimal kind of identifying information about you. And even if I collect something like a first name, I'm maybe not recording that name and I'm just using that during the interaction. It's actually not being saved with the data whatsoever. This is great because basically once you leave that room, I can't kind of connect this data back to you in any way. There's no way that somebody can kind of look at the responses you provided in this study and say, "Hey, those came from Alex." They'll say, "Oh, I don't know. I have no way to know who these responses came from." And that's really great because then even if the data gets revealed somehow, it gets hacked, whatever it might be, nobody's going to be able to trace it back to you. Confidentiality, alternatively, is another way of safeguarding privacy, which is that even if we are collecting identifiable information about you, that no one outside the research team is going to be aware of the identities of the people in the study or able to link those responses to individuals. So imagine that I come into the lab and they do collect my first name, my last name, my gender, my age, my race, my sexual orientation, maybe my phone number, email address, other kinds of ways that I might be identified. All of that information might be stored in a separate file from the responses that I'm giving in the study. And the only people who are going to have access to that kind of file that identifies who was in there are people on the research team. They're not going to reveal that information to other people unless, legally required to do so. They're going to kind of store this information separately in a way that makes it really difficult to link any responses I gave in the study to these identifying factors. And that's just when we can't necessarily maybe anonymize the study, another way of trying to safeguard privacy by making it more difficult to kind of trace who gave which responses. And those are our basic guidelines for ethical research. Again, very useful to kind of think about how these things manifest in actual research studies, but understanding the basic guidelines for conducting ethical research, and then also when we are using deception in research, the really vital importance of debriefing in social science research.